So as we continue our consideration of supernatural faith, we're going to have a chance to talk about some of the characteristics of faith. And in our session together, we'll look at some of those characteristics. I want to highlight one in particular during this video, and that's faith and certitude, the idea that faith is certain. Because I think often the common conception of faith, and even our colloquial way of speaking of faith as believers, is as something that's not certain. In fact, we use the word faith specifically as that which is not certain. I'm certain that the sun will rise tomorrow, but I have faith in this or that thing, specifically to mean, well, I'm not certain. But our faith tells us, our church tells us that faith has the characteristic of being certain. So let's look at that. The Catechism of the Catholic Church in paragraph 157 speaks about the certainty of faith. It says, faith is certain. It's more certain than all human knowledge because it's founded on the very word of God who cannot lie. Now remember, in all of the examples of human faith that we talked about, that we use all the time, it's based on the witness of other humans as their testimony. But humans are fallible. Humans lie. Humans can be wrong. When it comes to God who reveals, God can neither deceive nor be deceived. And so there's a certainty that comes with that, an objective certainty that's greater than other forms of human knowledge. It goes on to say, to be sure, revealed truths can seem obscure to human reason and experience. And that's certainly the case, that when it comes to things like the Trinity, it can seem very obscure to our reason or experience. But remember, we don't assent to these things. We don't give our assent. We don't place our faith in these things because they seem reasonable to us, but because God has revealed them. So revealed truths can seem obscure to human reason and experience, but the certainty that the divine light gives is greater than that which the light of natural reason gives. That's quoting St. Thomas Aquinas. And Cardinal John Henry Newman says, 10,000 difficulties do not make one doubt. Hang on to that quote because we'll talk about it towards the end of this presentation when we talk about doubt. What is doubt? And he notes that the obscurity of the things that we believe, even though it provides difficulties, does not constitute doubt. So how do we understand this? Well, Feingold lays out for us a number of the different kinds of certainty or grades of certainty. Moral certainty, scientific certainty, metaphysical certainty, and then the certainty of faith. And we want to take each one of these in turn. So moral certainty, it's actually hard to get a very good definition of moral certainty because it's used in different ways in different contexts. For our purposes, we can say that moral certainty is the kind of certainty on which we base our daily living. When we go into a gymnasium and sit down, we have moral certainty that the ceiling isn't going to collapse on us, right? Every time we sit down on a chair, we have moral certainty that it's not going to be pulled out from under us or collapse under us, right? This is the kind of certainty, it's a firm belief that we live our life by, right? There's my example. We have moral certainty that the roof of the building that we enter won't collapse. And all of the human faith that we talked about in the first video is based on the trustworthiness of a witness. But that trustworthiness depends on the moral character of the people whose witness we believe. And we can be mistaken in that, right? That's, we can have a firm assent to it, right? We can firmly believe that they're trustworthy, but we can be wrong. People can lie. People can be mistaken. People can be all kinds of things, right? But we can still live our life by that. So it's not absolute certainty. We should pause for a moment and say, well, what is certainty in general? Whenever we talk about certainty, we simply mean that we don't have a prudent fear that we could be wrong. Now, could we be wrong? Yes. So certainty doesn't necessarily mean absolute 100% certainty. Certainty is simply we don't have a prudent fear that the opposite could be true. So moral certainty is an example of this. Could it be that the ceiling will collapse on us? Sure, I'm not 100% absolute certain, but I have enough certainty to base my actions and my daily living on it. So again, moral certainty, though strong enough to base our daily living on, is subject to error. Well, then there's scientific certainty. We can say a few things about this. This is the certainty that nature will follow its natural laws, that if I drop a book, it's going to fall to the ground in a particular way. This is not completely certain scientific certainty, first of all, because science is always progressing and being revised and can improve. but also because God can work miracles that intervene or suspend the normal course of natural events. So first, our scientific knowledge can grow to greater certainty and can revise certain things, but also even though the normal course of natural events follows natural laws, it doesn't always have to be that case, because we do believe that God can work miracles, be they rare instances. Then there's metaphysical certainty. So when you think of absolute 100% mathematical certainty, this is what we're talking about. This is the certainty of first principles, as they're called, well, theoretical and practical. We looked at some of these first principles when we talked about the object of the intellect being seen. Remember that in our first video, where certain things are self-evident or necessarily true, first principles. So theoretical examples would be things like a thing is identical with itself. That's a first principle. It's absolutely certain. Once you know the meaning of the words, it's clearly certain in all cases. Or that a thing can't both be and not be in the same sense at the same time. That's a theoretical first principle that is always true in all cases. Practical first principles are the first principles of morality, like do good and avoid evil, or the golden rule, that they're always true in all cases. And this is where we talk about absolute certainty, that metaphysical certainty. And then there's this certainty of faith that is a particular kind of certainty. It's the certainty that God's revealed word is true because God is the truth and cannot err or deceive. So this is a certainty based on the witness of God who reveals himself. Because it rests on God who is the truth, the certainty of faith has a unique power to serve as the foundation for human life. The foundation for human life. This isn't certainty that the ceiling won't collapse or that the chair is going to hold me. This is certainty about the questions of the meaning of existence, the purpose for my being here, and how to conduct everything. So you can see that this is this God's revelation has a particular role in giving a foundation to human life, and this is the certainty of faith. In the process of coming to the certainty of faith, we have to make use of metaphysical and moral certainties with regard to the human mediators of revelation. That is, remember we saw in the last video, when it comes to, well, how do I know that God has revealed himself here in this way? We make use of moral certainties, right? We have to rely on human mediators like the prophets, the apostles, the church. So we come to this certainty of faith by making use of these other certainties. But that's not to say that the certainty of faith is simply the product of natural certainties or probabilities. It's more than that. The certainty of faith is more than that because it rests also on the power of God's grace. And again, we bring in this concept of God's grace as a necessary element of supernatural faith. Precisely because faith involves a properly divine certainty, right? A certainty based on God who reveals. It's impossible without this supernatural aid. Without God's influx of grace, there is no ascent of faith, period. So when we talk about faith being certain, this can seem kind of counterintuitive to our experience, but we would say, but it doesn't feel certain at times. So we want to make a distinction, and we can go, we can look at St. Thomas Aquinas to help us with this distinction and what this means. So St. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century theologian, said certitude can be looked at in two ways. So he's making a good distinction here. First, we can look at certitude on the part of its cause. What causes certitude? And thus a thing which has a more certain cause is itself more certain. In this way, faith is more certain, because it's founded on the divine truth, where other kinds of knowing are based on human reason. So St. Thomas is giving us kind of this objective certitude of faith. It's certain because of its cause. It's the cause, God revealing, is more certain than other kinds of human belief. But then secondly, certitude may be considered on the part of the subject. That's us. So in the first way, we look at a certitude based on God. Now in the second way, we look at the certitude of faith on our part, the part of the subject. And thus, the more a man's intellect lays hold of a thing, right, the more we grasp a thing with our intellect, the more certain it is. In this way, faith is less certain because matters of faith are above the human intellect. So in all this talk of faith, we do need to make this distinction that when we speak of the certitude of faith, we're especially talking about the certitude that comes from its cause. That certainty is caused by God who reveals. For us on our side, it may not seem that way subjectively because our intellect doesn't grab hold of these matters the way it grabs hold of things like the sky is blue, And Thomas concludes, since, however, a thing is judged simply with regards to its cause, but relatively with respect to a disposition on the part of the subject, it follows that faith is more certain simply while the others are more certain relatively. So he's just using these two things to say, this is why we can say simply that faith is certain. Because we usually, he says, it's a good way to talk to speak of a thing's cause rather than how people might experience it. We can look at this another way. We can sum this up with Cardinal Avery Dulles. He gives us this same point. He says, faith is certain in the objective sense. Why? Because its contents is from God. Its content is from God. That's the cause. Faith is certain in the objective sense because its content is from God, who can neither be deceived nor deceived. It is subjectively certain because the signs of credibility are synthesized under the light of a divinely given inclination to believe. That is, if we have that subjective understanding of the certainty of faith, it's because of a light of divinely given inclination to believe. That's grace, right? Even though the assent is subjectively certain, the lack of cogent evidence leaves room for a certain mental dissatisfaction or unrest within the faith. And remember, we saw John Henry Newman in the first slide talked about how 1,000 difficulties doesn't make one doubt. So Cardinal Dulles is talking about these difficulties when it comes to this mental dissatisfaction or unrest within the faith. I may not understand the Trinity. I may wrestle with it, how to understand it, and I do. I may wrestle or not understand how God can permit suffering. But all this mental dissatisfaction or unrest within the faith doesn't amount to a doubt where I say, no, God, I won't believe. And that's why we have to look at doubt in a moment. Cardinal Dulles says, faith is still obscure. Even though it's certain, it's obscure because its contents is neither immediately evident nor strictly demonstrable, right? It's unseen. And also because it adheres to mysteries that exceed the comprehensive powers of the human mind. So something can be, in this sense, both certain but obscure, and that's what our faith is. We'll end with this. The Catechism talks about doubt when it comes to the first commandment. It says the first commandment requires us to nourish and protect our faith with prudence and vigilance, and to reject everything that's opposed to it. And there are various ways of sinning against faith. So what's a sin against faith? Voluntary doubt about the faith disregards or refuses to hold as true what God has revealed and the church proposes for belief. Now notice this is voluntary doubt, right? This is not, I struggle with something. This is not, I don't understand. This is not that restlessness of the mind. This is not a fleeting wondering. Voluntary doubt is, I refuse assent, right? Faith is giving assent to God because he has revealed himself, and therefore I believe. Voluntary doubt is the choice to disregard what God has revealed and substitute something else. It really calls into question God's character. So remember what Cardinal Newman said, 1,000 difficulties don't make a single doubt. I can have many difficulties in coming to understand or grapple with something, but that doesn't mean I reject God's revelation and withhold my assent. And finally, involuntary doubt refers to hesitation in believing, difficulty in overcoming objections connected with the faith, or also anxiety aroused by its obscurity. If deliberately cultivated, doubt can lead to spiritual blindness. So voluntary doubt is the sin involved here where I reject revelation and question God's revelation. Involuntary doubt only becomes sinful when it is chosen